A gentle rustling echoed through the forest as the evergreens swayed in the crisp autumn breeze. There was little other sound to be heard. The birds had already flown southwards to escape the approaching chill, and both predator and prey alike were cautious not to disturb the fallen leaves for fear of drawing unwanted attention. A rabbit darted through the underbrush, sniffing about for any morsels that it could find to fatten up before hibernation time arrived. Fortune seemed to favor the rodent, for it had found a few plump, tasty berries that had dropped from their bush. The rabbit hopped over, its nose twitching constantly as it sniffed the air. It took a few tentative nibbles of a berry. Finding it to its liking, it moved forward to reach the rest, brushing against a fallen branch as it did so. Twang! The rabbit dangled by its neck in the sprung snare trap, swinging gently in the breeze like a victim of the gallows. The grim sight would remain until the trap's creator came to check on it hours later, footsteps barely making a sound in the fallen pine needles. At last, the soft voice of a woman sighed as she freed her prey from its trap and reset it. She was a small figure, her features otherwise hidden by the leathers and furs that she wore. With her prize held in one hand, the hunter walked to a stream several dozen meters away from her trap before sitting down on a nearby rock. Reaching down, she pulled out a small knife from a sheath attached to her boot and began the task of cleaning and skinning the rabbit. It was messy, unpleasant work, but it was essential and was done with practiced skill. After dipping her hands into the cold stream to clean her hands and knife of the rabbit's blood, the hunter made her way deeper into the woods to a small clearing, where a simple tent and a pile of sticks encircled by a ring of stones awaited her. Setting aside her catch, she reached into a pocket and took out a pair of stones. Leaning close to the woodpile, she began to strike the two stones together, sparks flying from between them as she did so. After a few strikes, enough of the sparks had touched the dried wood for it to start smoldering and eventually become a small fire. Once the flames had reached a suitable level, the hunter mounted her catch onto a larger, sturdier stick and set it between two branches on either side of the fire to cook. With her meal secured, the hunter lowered her hood and released a deep sigh, her breath misting in the air. Her darkly tanned skin flushed slightly as the chilly evening air nipped at her cheeks. Short, ebony hair, cut to avoid snagging on branches, barely stirred in the breeze. Umber eyes watched the flames dance in the twilight. Her pointed ears identified the woman as an elfican, an elf. Sila'a was her name. Sila'a shivered as the cold evening air continued to bite at her, so she edged closer to the fire to soak in its warmth. Each day's cooling tested her patience. She preferred the milder climate of Zephyr, one of a cluster of southern islands and her birthplace, but she was duty-bound to stay, for she was training to become a ranger. Rangers are the protectors of elven lands and interests, serving as both law enforcers and a first line of defense against potential invaders. A position among the Rangers is a rare and sought-after honor. They were famed worldwide for their exceptional marksmanship and survival skills, reportedly able to hit a fly with an arrow from over 500 meters and survive in even the most desolate wastelands. While these accounts may be exaggerated, one aspect of Ranger training was to endure for a year in an unfamiliar place without supplies or assistance from others. Sila had been brought to this forest at first frost. The winter that followed was the harshest she had ever endured, but she persevered, and now her year of quasi-exile was drawing to a close. Within a week, frost would begin forming on the ground again, marking the end of her trial. She would then make her way to a nearby town to freshen up and enjoy a night in a warm bed, before arranging passage to the nearest ranger outpost to start the next phase of her training. As the rabbit finished cooking, Sila'a removed the roasted animal from the fire and took a bite. While eating, one hand absently toyed with the ivory pendant around her neck, her sole keepsake from home. As she dined on the meat, she imagined how proud her family would be when they saw her wearing the ranger regalia. Suddenly, the autumn evening air didn't feel quite so cold. Deep in the forest, nestled near a quiet stream and far removed from any settlement, a solitary cabin stood. Wisps of smoke drifted from the chimney, dissipating in the crisp autumn air. Inside, the dwelling's sole inhabitant worked silently on the object before him. Scarred, calloused hands firmly held a cloth as they moved meticulously over a metal shell, buffed to a mirror-like sheen even in the dim firelight. Its caretaker was a dwarf, or Devikan in the ancient tongue. He was a stout being, almost as wide as he was tall. Despite his compact frame, beneath his pale, weathered skin were powerful, taut muscles, capable of shattering rock and twisting metal with ease. His head was adorned with a mane of hair reaching his waist and silvered with age, his face obscured by an equally long and gray beard. Though his hands moved across the armor with careful, measured motions, one would see that his eyes were not focused on his task or anything else in the room. Instead, they were fixed on memories of battles long past. His name was Thorgar Steelshield, and the armor he was so diligently tending to was from his time as a soldier serving Ironhold, the dwarven kingdom that ruled much of the area. He had previously served as a vanguard, rushing into battle encased in an impenetrable shell of steel to break through enemy lines and create openings for other troops. His speed and unstoppable nature earned him the moniker Swiftwall. He excelled in his role, but even the hardest stones eventually crumble from erosion. Nearly a century of charging headlong into opposing forces, coating his face and armor in the blood of his enemies, took its toll on his mind until it finally snapped. His nights were haunted by visions of those who fell to his hammer, and decades of narrowly avoiding traps set by foes had left him agitated and paranoid, perceiving danger in every nook and shadow. He was swiftly retired from the army and sent away, permitted to keep his armor but not his weapon. Initially, he was sent to reside in Mistholm, a small trading village at the mountain's base, but the clamor and bustle quickly wore on his already fragile psyche, and he departed to make himself the small hermitage he now inhabited, nearly 2 days' walk from the village proper. It was just as well. Few wished to interact with a paranoid, war-addled veteran. Thus he remained for the next 3 decades. Some reckless youths had tried to bother him when he first arrived, being chased off by a steel-clad monster, yelling madly and wielding a woodcutter's axe as effortlessly as if it were made entirely of straw, quickly dissuaded them and future generations from that notion. The chest armor polished to his liking, Bakron put it aside and reached for a gauntlet when he felt an unsettling sensation in his gut, halting his hand. The former vanguard's sense for danger had contributed to his relatively long career in the profession. A combat-honed intuition that at times verged on prescience, many of his comrades had jestingly suggested that Devey himself communicated with Bakron through the earth. Bakron himself thought that it was merely decades of experience guiding him, for Devey surely had more important matters than directing one dwarf. Whatever the cause, his instincts were now telling him that something was gravely amiss with the nearby village. With agility and speed that belied his advanced years, Bakron had fastened the armor to his body, encasing himself within a gleaming steel shell. As he placed his helmet over his head, the grizzled old veteran felt a clarity of mind that he had not experienced in a long time. He tossed a bucketful of water into his hearth and marched out toward the village, clutching his axe in one hand and a crossbow in the other, hoping with each step that he was not too late to prevent whatever disaster was approaching. Many miles away, a cloaked figure trudged across the countryside, walking stick in hand and a mule laden with bags by their side. The traveler's attire was a mismatched collection of different cloths and leathers, stitched together in a patchwork fashion and adorned with pockets of varying size and placement. Though sewn on by a skilled and capable hand, the sheer variety of materials hinted that little of the original fabric remained under the numerous repairs. The ensemble was concealed by a heavy cloak to shield its wearer from the approaching chill. The figure was further protected by a scarf wrapped around their face, leaving only a pair of bright blue eyes visible. The wanderer paused as a stiff breeze blew past, the chill biting them even below their heavy clothing. Rummaging through one of the mule's packs, the cloaked figure retrieved a water skin. A hand reached up to pull the scarf down, revealing the face of a Huamkin, a human. Kalen was his name, a man with pale skin, now flushed from the cold, and covered with light brown stubble. Removing the bottle's cork, the man tilted his head back and took a drink of its contents. As the wine contained within flowed down his throat and into his belly, he immediately felt warmth return to his body. Satisfied for the moment, he returned his skin of wine to its original bag, before pulling his scarf back up, concealing his face once more. Delving into one of his numerous pockets, Kalen extracted a folded piece of parchment and unfolded it. The parchment bore a map of the area, slightly faded from age and use, but still readable. After a moment to orient himself, Kalen determined that he was roughly 2 days' travel from Mistholm. This was fortunate for him, as his destination lay further north, and his provisions were dwindling. He had heard of Mistholm before, a small trading settlement that was technically in dwarven territory and primarily inhabited by the short-statured folk. However, its proximity to the border of elvish lands had resulted in a considerable elven population as well. A bit odd given the two races' past conflicts, but preferable to the alternative, he mused. Kalen hoped their interracial cooperation would extend to him too. Few welcomed the company of humans, even a solitary one like himself. Many viewed them as drifters and robbers, and more superstitious individuals believed they could strip away a person's magical ability entirely, due to their capacity to use magic from all races, however limited. Kalen himself had endured others' mistrust in his travels. Many shopkeepers would outright refuse his business, and those who tolerated his presence kept a constant watchful eye on him, as if he might abscond with all their wares, should their vigilance falter for even a moment. He had also found himself in more back-alley brawls than he cared to remember. Glancing up from his map, Kalen could just make out the village in the distance, dwellings and shops encircled by tall wooden walls, and sheltered from behind by the mountain itself. But as he gazed at the tiny structures in the distance, something seemed amiss to him. Folding the map back up and returning it to his pocket, Kalen produced a simple brass spyglass and peered through its lens. "Something's not right," he muttered to himself as he looked through his spyglass. With the winter season approaching, every hearth in the village should have been lit, but there wasn't a single trace of smoke rising from the buildings, nor was there any movement or any indication at all that people still resided there. Worse, the gates that would have safeguarded the village from intruders lay shattered on the ground. Someone or something had assaulted the village, and likely recently too, or else the place would have been teeming with guards to investigate. Kalen clenched his jaw anxiously. This felt oddly familiar, yet it couldn't be. Still, the possibility was too significant to disregard. The risks of a peacekeeper catching him exploring the seemingly deserted village were severe. Given the widespread hostility towards humans, they might view him as a plunderer or worse, assume he was responsible for the events, and execute him on the spot. However, if he could uncover hints about what occurred there, it would greatly aid his quest. Lamenting his lack of a horse, Kalen reached into his hood and grasped the object nestled against his cheek. In his hand was a speckled red sparrow, which ruffled its feathers against the chill in handling. "Whisper, I know it's frigid out here," Kalen said to the disgruntled bird. "But I need you to fly over there and see what you can discover," he continued, gesturing towards the distant village. The bird cocked its head in that jerky, inquisitive manner birds often do before chirping, once in understanding and fluttering off towards the settlement. Gripping his staff, Kalen tugged his pack mule forward and began to follow his feathered companion. If the village was as Kalen suspected, the human doubted he would find any survivors. With luck, he might at least find some answers. Weighing in at 2,400 words and change, it's one of my more concise works. I hope it's still engaging. A question for you. I have some ideas for background information to flesh out the universe, but it may not be immediately or ever relevant to the plot. Should I put these in codex-like shorts like On Blood Magic, or create a wiki page and place it there? I'm also open to suggestions for content. Don't forget to leave a review. Next chapter. If anyone were traveling the road to Mistholm, they would have encountered the peculiar sight of a cheerful elvish woman dressed in furs with such a bounce in her step, she was almost skipping towards the village. When she had awoken that morning, Silala noticed the ground was covered with a thin layer of frost, signaling the end of her isolation. Now she could proceed to the next stage of her training, which would hopefully take her to more familiar and, more importantly, warmer regions. Her cheerful disposition wavered as she neared the village entrance. Where once stood two large imposing gates, there was now a gaping hole in the village walls. The young woman instantly fell back on her ranger training, grasping her bow in one hand and nocking an arrow with the other. Cautiously and deliberately, she approached the village, observing the shattered remains of the gates strewn on the ground. The gates had been two massive wooden doors, over twice her height and nearly an arm's length thick. Few things could damage such doors aside from siege engines, yet they lay before her, splintered like deadwood. She scanned the area for signs of what might have caused it. Something capable of such destruction must have left some kind of trace, but she discovered nothing. The only tracks she saw besides her own were 3 sets of footprints leading into the village, 2 belonging to men and 1 to a small horse or similar beast. Seeing no immediate danger, Sila knelt down to examine the tracks more closely. It appeared that one man and the animal had arrived first, followed a few hours later by the second man, though both had come no more than a day ago. Based on the depth of the second set of footprints and how compacted the earth beneath them was, the second man was likely considerably heavier than the first. The animal tracks soon led to a pack mule tied to a random post just inside the village proper, with the 2 sets of footprints continuing deeper into the village. Sila warily followed the path that the footprints made, her eyes constantly darting from roof to corner to broken window, alert for any possible ambushes. Her vigilance was interrupted when she noticed something above her, a red sparrow fluttering through the air. As she gazed in puzzlement at what such a bird was doing here at this time of year, it flew off into the village, chirping as birds do. Within moments, she heard the faint but distinct thud of an arrow striking wood, followed seconds later by a shout of anger and the resonant sound of wood hitting metal. Casting caution aside, Sela dashed towards the cry. Kalen felt uneasy as he stepped into Mistholm. The village was utterly lifeless, with wind making eerie sounds as it rushed through shattered windows and broken doorways. Tethering his mule to a nearby post, the man cautiously explored the village, his staff at the ready. He searched the houses, looking for any hints about what had occurred here, while also gathering a few easily carried supplies. He figured the original owners wouldn't miss them. The damage to the buildings made it clear that something had ravaged this village, but he couldn't find a single piece of evidence indicating what, not even a speck of blood from victims or attackers. Stepping outside, Kalen sighed in frustration and rubbed his forehead, contemplating his next move. Noticing a faint, flickering shadow, the cloaked human glanced up to see Whisper fluttering about. Chirp, chirp, cheep, the sparrow sang, and Kalen swiftly dodged right. He narrowly avoided a crossbow bolt that embedded itself in the nearby wall, right where his heart had been. Acting instinctively, Kalen reached into his sleeve and pulled out a small knife, 2 finger widths wide and barely a finger long, throwing it towards the bolt's origin. The blade glinted bronze in the muted sunlight. He was rewarded with the sound of metal hitting wood, and turned to see a rather angry-looking, steel-clad dwarf. One hand held a woodcutter's axe and the other a crossbow with a bronze knife lodged in it and a cut drawstring hanging uselessly from either arm. Discarding the disabled weapon, the dwarf charged forward with the axe, shouting a battle cry. As Bakron neared, Kalen sidestepped again, barely avoiding the berserker's axe. While dodging, Kalen swung his staff, deflecting the axe with one end, while the other struck the back of the attacker's head with a solid thwack of heavy wood on metal. Rather than stunning him, as Kalen expected, the blow seemed only to anger the dwarf, who retaliated with another axe swing that nearly severed Kalen's head. Evading the swipe, Kalen countered with a direct thrust into Bakron's chest. The wooden rod struck firmly, but it might as well have hit a wall for all the impact it had. The clash between the two resembled a fierce choreography. The dwarf wielded his massive weapon as if it were weightless, while the human deftly evaded the blows, aware that a single touch from the iron blade could split him in half. After each miss, Kalen countered with a strike from his staff. Aside from the occasional shallow dent in the armor, such attacks seemed to only irritate his adversary. Though Bakron outmatched his opponent in strength, vanguards were designed to swiftly breach and shatter enemy lines before receiving support from the main force, not to engage in prolonged one-on-one combat. As the battle wore on, Bakron grew fatigued and careless. He overreached on a downward swing, exposing himself. Kalen seized the opportunity, gripping his staff at one end with both hands. The human swung with all his might at the back of his attacker's knee, lifting the limb and throwing the warrior off balance. With another blow to the chest, the dwarf was finally toppled onto his back, his axe slipping from his grasp. Producing another knife from his sleeve, Kalen knelt beside the fallen dwarf and readied to deliver the final strike when a voice cut through the air. "Stop!" he heard a woman cry out, halting his hand. He turned towards the voice to see a woman, an elf judging by her ears, aiming an arrow directly at him. "Drop it now," she commanded firmly. Kalen promptly opened his hand, letting the bronze dagger fall to the ground. "Stand up slowly," Silaha instructed. He obeyed her order, keeping his hands raised non-threateningly, stepping away from his downed opponent for good measure. "You too," the woman continued, shifting her aim slightly. Kalen followed her gaze to the dwarf, who had once again tightly grasped his axe. With a soft growl, the dwarf released his hold on his weapon and pulled himself to his feet. "Now, can someone explain to me what in Oros's name is happening here?" she demanded, easing her pull on the bowstring, but keeping the arrow nocked. "He assaulted me without provocation," Kalen promptly stated, gesturing towards the dwarf. "I was merely examining the village." "I observed you taking items from the houses you entered," Bakron countered accusingly. The elf fixed a disapproving look at the cloaked human. "So you're a scavenger?" she inquired calmly. "I prefer to think of it as reclaiming," Kalen responded lightly. "And no, I was actually en route here on other matters, and I noticed that something was amiss." The elf seemed to accept his explanation for now and shifted her gaze to the dwarf. After a few moments of defiant staring, he answered, "I sensed that something was wrong in the village and came to investigate," he explained. "When I arrived, I found him," he continued, nodding towards Kalen, "and I suspected that he might be involved in the village's current condition." Kalen scowled at the accusation. "I am not responsible for what befell this village," Kalen growled angrily. At that moment, Whisper alighted on his shoulder and began to whistle a calming tune. Taking a deep, steadying breath, he added, "But I may have an idea as to what did." Both Silaha and Bakron looked at him in surprise, and in the dwarf's case, skepticism. "What was it?" Silaha asked, prompted both by duty and her own inquisitiveness. "Not out here." Kalen dismissed her as he collected his knives. "Let's go inside. It'll be easier to explain there." After returning to his mule to retrieve a large folded piece of parchment from one of the bags, the trio entered the nearest, most intact building, a tavern where much of the furniture was ruined. Stepping behind the bar, Kalen unfolded the parchment to reveal a map of the country. 3 points on the map were circled, not marking any known settlements, but showing a general northward direction. "Nearly a year ago, I came across the remains of one of our tribes here," the cloaked human began, indicating the lowest circle. "It was like this village. The settlements and supplies were destroyed, but there were no bodies, nor any clues as to what had attacked them. A few months later, I heard that another tribe had been attacked, with the same outcome. And then another." As he spoke, Kalen traced his finger across the map, passing over each circle in turn. "Based on the pattern, I estimated that the Nomada tribe would be the next to be affected. And at this time of year, they should be about here," he continued, circling the far side of the mountain that they were currently bordering with his finger. "I was hoping that I could reach them in time to warn them, or at least determine what has been attacking our tribes." "How large were these tribes that were attacked?" Sila inquired as she contemplated the information. "They were some of the smaller tribes, so relatively few," Kalen replied with a shrug. "Still, there are over 2,000 individuals missing in total." Sila felt her jaw drop at the news. 2,000 people vanishing without a trace was concerning enough, but for them to be, until now, it seemed, entirely human, suggested only one possibility that she did not want to consider. Fortunately for her, she was not the one to voice her concerns. "Necromancers," Bakron growled, his voice laced with hatred. Necromancers were dark magicians, animating armies of corpses to do their bidding. The crucial component for their abilities was blood, specifically human blood, without which they could not animate their minions. And as a necromancer's army grew, so too did their need for blood, far more than any one person could provide, so they would capture humans and drain them dry to fuel their vile magic. An army powered by 2,000 people would be truly massive. "That's what I suspected as well," Kalen agreed with his former adversary. But that doesn't explain why they would attack this village without a single human within its walls, he continued, mostly to himself. Elf and dwarf blood are useless to a necromancer, and if they needed corpses to animate, then it would be simpler and easier to simply raid a cemetery or crypt. Something doesn't add up, but my best chance of solving this mystery is intercepting them when they attack the Nomada tribe, which means that I should depart with all haste, he said as he swiftly folded his map back up. Wait, Silissa exclaimed. I wish to join you. If there truly is a necromancer roaming about, then as a ranger, it is my duty to bring such a monster to justice, she solemnly declared, omitting the part where she was only a ranger in training. After a moment's consideration, Bakron rumbled, I'll go too. I best ensure that this necromancer of yours is properly put down for the good of everybody. He fixed a glare at Kalen, as if silently implying that he suspected that the human would ally with said necromancer if he were not there to watch him. Well, Kalen trailed off, evidently not anticipating their willingness to join his quest. I suppose a ranger and a warrior of your caliber would be quite valuable in defeating this enigmatic adversary. In fact, Kalen glanced around and managed to find an intact bottle of spirits and 3 small wooden cups. Let us take this opportunity to toast our newfound alliance, he proposed as he poured a dark brown liquid into each cup and handed one to each of his new traveling companions. Bakron eyed the beverage suspiciously and gave it a wary sniff. Seemingly satisfied that it wasn't poisoned, he downed it in one gulp, his expression unchanging. Sila also sniffed her drink. The odor stung her nose, but upon seeing her dwarven companion swallow it without ill effect, she attempted to mimic his feat, only to gag and nearly retch at the foul taste and terrible burning sensation. Kalen himself resisted the urge to wince in distaste when he sipped his portion, feeling the alcohol sear its way down. As he observed the grim dwarf and the heaving she-elf before him, Kalen's lips began to curl into a smirk. "And what is it you find so amusing?" Bakron grumbled as he helped himself to another serving of liquor. "A thought just crossed my mind," the human replied as he took another sip of his drink. "An elf, a dwarf, and a human all meet in a tavern and decide to embark on an adventure. It sounds like the start of a poor jest." Bakron felt uneasy with his current situation. After introductions were made between himself, Kalen, and Silaya, the human had resumed his scavenging to replenish his supplies. To the elderly dwarf's amusement, Silaya had persuaded Kalen to purchase his supplies by leaving a large handful of copper coins on the tavern counter. She threatened to have him arrested for pillaging if he did not. While Bakron doubted that she could actually follow through with her threat, he found it highly improbable that an elf as young as her was a full-fledged ranger. The look of irritation that crossed the human's face brought joy to his heart. Bakron glanced up at Kalen, who was now guiding them around the mountain to where he claimed this tribe of humans were located. He was the source of the old veteran's concerns. Simply put, Bakron didn't trust him. He didn't entirely dismiss Kalen's tale. It would be foolish to ignore even the faintest possibility of a necromancer. But something about the wanderer unsettled the old dwarf. Bakron hardly considered himself an expert on the intricacies of human culture, but over his long life he had picked up a few insights. One of these was that humans rarely traveled alone. The tribe typically moved as one, and if they couldn't all enter a town or city at once, they would always send a small group of at least 3 people to conduct their business, while the rest of the tribe waited nearby. Yet Kalen appeared to be journeying on his own with no sign of his tribe anywhere close. And there would be signs. Hundreds of people moving together was not a subtle affair. Bakron also knew there were exceptions to this rule. Exiles who had been cast out from their tribe for crimes so terrible that no one would accept them. The veteran had encountered quite a few of these outcasts, usually in the form of mercenaries who typically fought for greed or sadism rather than loyalty to a cause. The veteran mentally admitted that it was possible Kalen was a member of one of the first tribes to be destroyed, who had somehow survived, and that this was also a personal quest for vengeance, but he doubted it. When Kalen explained the situation to them, Bakron did not detect a hidden pain in his eyes, nor the fiery gleam of righteous fury. Silaa, young and inexperienced as she seemed to be, likely did not notice it. The cloaked wanderer currently leading them may well be sincere about his aims to stop this mysterious necromancer, but he also clearly had another agenda at hand. He doubted that the elf would recognize or act upon any suspicious behavior from their current guide, so the responsibility fell to him. He would keep a watchful eye over the human, and if necessary, put a stop to his schemes by any means required. Celia panted and wheezed with effort as she plodded along behind Kalen and his mule, with Bakron bringing up the rear. While she hadn't exactly been idle during her year surviving in the forest, there was quite a difference between the leisurely pace of foraging for edible plants or carefully stalking prey she had been doing then and the brisk, determined strides she was taking now, a fact that was starting to wear on her. Not helping was the rocky, uneven terrain they were traversing, making it challenging to maintain steady footing. While she supposed it was understandable for a wanderer like Kalen to be adept at navigating such uncertain ground, it annoyed her slightly to see Bakron, who was both considerably shorter than her and more heavily burdened with his steel armor, keeping pace with them without any apparent difficulty. She noticed she was beginning to lag behind, and so quickened her pace, clenching her teeth and ignoring the burning ache spreading through her legs. If an old man 2/3 her height and twice her weight could keep up, then she would too, damn it. Her pride as a future ranger was at stake. She glanced behind her and groaned. Despite walking at a rather brisk pace for what seemed like hours, she could still see Mistholm, albeit quite far in the distance. Just how massive was this mountain they were circling? The trio walked until the sun had set behind the mountain and the sky was barely illuminated. They were still close enough to the forest that they could enter and gather firewood. After a few strikes with the flint to ignite the fire, Celia collapsed in front of the blaze with an exhausted sigh, grateful that her feet were finally granted rest. Despite their more stoic demeanors throughout the journey, Kalen and Bakron made similar sounds as they took their places by the fire, revealing comparable feelings. As they savored the warmth and dined on their modest supper of jerky and stale bread, Celia observed their nominal leader through the corner of her eye. She had heard tales about humans from her parents, mostly about how they would abduct her if she didn't eat her vegetables or do her chores like a good little girl. At first, she had believed it like any child would, but as she grew older, she started to feel curious about the mysterious race of wanderers. Why did they roam the world, never settling down in one place? She knew of the story about how the world was created, and how there were no more realms for the humans to rule over because they had all been claimed by the other, older races. But that was just a tale. The world was vast. Surely there had to be some place that they could call their own, right? And their entire race couldn't possibly consist solely of thieves and charlatans. So why did everyone look down on them so? But she had grown up on an island far from the mainland or major trade routes, so she never had the chance to approach one and ask. The human she was sharing company with now seemed to be an all-right sort, if a bit morally flexible. "You've been gazing at me for quite some time now. Is everything all right?" Kalen inquired casually, causing Celia to inwardly wince. Had she truly been that noticeable? She fumbled, trying to formulate a response. "I was just pondering why necromancers do what they do," she eventually decided. "I mean, they're all aware they'd face execution if caught, so why inflict so much suffering and anguish?" she continued, struggling not to blush in embarrassment. First, she was caught observing her companion, a rookie mistake in itself. And then she stumbled over her words like a schoolgirl, mustering courage to speak to her crush. She was a ranger, the pride of the Elvish Empire. She ought to be better than this. Fortunately for her pride, Kalen either didn't notice or chose not to remark on her flustered state when he answered. "Power," he said promptly, looking up in surprise when Bakron had echoed his response. Kalen nodded, yielding the conversation to the dwarf. "It's all about power, lass," Bakron explained gruffly. "There's something about that magic. It corrupts their minds, makes them crave it," he continued. Kalen's expression tightened, as if he greatly wished to comment on that, but remained silent. The fear, the chaos, it's intoxicating to them. They can't get enough of it. "And those are the more rational ones," Kalen interjected, still appearing slightly displeased at Bakron's description of them. The less rational ones tend to get ideas. Celia blinked in confusion at the emphasis Kalen used. What do you mean by ideas? She asked. Kalen gave Bakron a brief glance before continuing. A little over a century ago, there was a dwarf named Alric, wealthy, popular, and from what I've heard, quite skilled in alchemy. The elf nodded slowly, following along but not grasping where the story was heading. Well, he decided he could create a stone that could turn lead into gold and concoct a potion that would grant eternal life, Kalen continued to explain. And somehow, he convinced himself that human blood was a crucial ingredient in this little mixture of his. The human took a deep, steadying breath. Over 4,000 humans were slaughtered to fuel his experiments, not counting the lives lost to bring that monster down, he concluded grimly. With a bitter scoff, he added, and the worst part, he never even came close to completing his philosopher's stone. Celia gasped in horror at the senseless loss of so many lives. She looked to Bakron, who, despite his face contorted into a bitter scowl, did not dispute the human's account. That's dreadful, she exclaimed, at a loss for words to convey her feelings. There's a reason they call him the mad alchemist, lass, the grizzled dwarf rumbled. Celia worked her jaw, speechless. I'm amazed that you don't harbor resentment towards the dwarves for that, she said quietly, still grappling with the scale of the tragedy. Oh, certainly, there are many humans who do, Kalen replied cheerfully, his upbeat tone at odds with the somber nature of the discussion. As for me personally, well, I've had experience being lumped in with a madman, so it's not a sentiment I'm particularly inclined to hold, he continued grimly. I see, Celia said softly. For several tense moments, only the crackling of the fire broke the silence. How do you two know so much about necromancers anyway? She finally asked to dispel the awkward atmosphere. I have experience with them, Kalen answered nonchalantly. Dealt with them before, Bakron grunted at the same time. The two glanced at each other, with Bakron yielding the conversation this time. I've encountered a few in my travels, the Wanderer elaborated. Never to the extent of the one we're pursuing now, though. If you can catch them before they truly establish themselves and their army, they're essentially just murderers who dig up corpses instead of burying them. Often, necromancers will set up their lairs in caves, Bakron continued. Sometimes, those caves would be part of our network and be discovered by scouts or travelers. Then they'd send people like me to eliminate them. The group lapsed back into uneasy silence. Other than to establish the watch routine, not another word was exchanged that night. For 3 days, the trio walked along the mountain's perimeter. Dirt and gravel crunched beneath their feet, soon joined by a thin layer of snow. Thick plumes of fog billowed from their mouths as they breathed the chilly winter air. Occasionally, Kalen's pet sparrow Whisper would flit through the air above them, but spent most of its time safely tucked away in the warm depths of its master's cloak. You know, I've been pondering, Celia remarked as they trudged through the ankle-deep blanket of snow. If we happen to encounter this necromancer and his forces, how exactly are the three of us meant to stop them? She inquired. I've collected a few artifacts over time that should aid with that, Kalen answered cryptically. With luck, once we reach the Nomada tribe, we can arrange a trap for the necromancer, and I won't need to utilize them. Why not? The aspiring ranger asked. Bakron was discreetly listening, also curious about the response. Because these items are rather challenging to obtain, particularly for someone like me, Kalen explained. Celia frowned in puzzlement and frustration at his ambiguous reply and pressed for more information. However, the human declined to elaborate further, fueling her curiosity. Throughout the day, she kept glancing at his mule, wondering what mysteries he had concealed in its packs. A few hours later, they paused to rest and relieve themselves. As Kalen vanished, Celia had to resist the urge to dash to the resting pack animal and search through the bags weighing it down. So you're inquisitive too, eh? Bakron said abruptly, startling her. He briefly laughed when she jumped, but quickly adopted a mask of complete seriousness. Proceed with caution, girlie. A man with secrets often takes steps to safeguard them, he cautioned solemnly. Kalen soon returned. After tending to their respective needs, they resumed their journey onward. Throughout the remainder of the day and into the next, Scylla mulled over her dwarven companion's words. Eventually, her curiosity outweighed her wariness about whatever traps Kalen might have hidden within his belongings. That night, once she was certain that the human was in deep slumber, she crept over to the sleeping mule, taking care not to make a sound with her steps, and carefully searched through the bags. The first and second only contained food, water, and a few folded maps, but in the third, concealed under some rags, she discovered two items of interest. The first item was a small wooden box, roughly the size of her foot, simple and unadorned, save for a brass strip running along its middle, ending with a slightly indented circle where one might expect a keyhole. She gently shook it, but heard no sound from within. She attempted to open it, yet it remained firmly closed, despite no visible latch or lock. The second object was something that seemed to defy easy categorization. It was small, about the size of her fist, and crafted from a metal as black as the night sky above. It had 6 sides, tapering slightly at both ends. Each face was inscribed with runes she neither understood nor recognized. Despite its small size, it felt surprisingly heavy in her hand, and she sensed a faint, barely perceptible weight in the back of her mind. Whatever this thing was, it was clearly a magical item of some kind, and likely a rather powerful one if she could sense its presence even in this dormant state. An artifact of this caliber was probably both rare and extremely valuable. So what was a vagabond like Kalen, whose attire seemed to consist entirely of rags crudely sewn together to resemble clothing, doing with such an item? And what might he be concealing in what was evidently a magically sealed box? Scylla heard movement from where Kalen was sleeping, so she quickly returned the two objects to their place and closed the bag. Fortunately, the human was merely shifting in his sleep and remained unaware of her investigation. Exhaling softly in relief, the elf resumed her watch until it was time to wake Bakron for his shift. But even after she had gone to bed, the mystery of Kalen's artifacts continued to trouble her mind. She slept little that night. For 2 more days the trio journeyed, the forest receding ever further behind them as they ventured deeper into plains of endless white. Despite seeing nothing to aid in navigation, Kalen, occasionally consulting his map, continued to walk purposefully, seemingly sure of his bearings. Scylla and Bakron both hoped his confidence was well-founded, for neither of them relished the thought of perishing in these frozen wastes. That morning, Whisper had flown off to wherever birds like it went when stuck in the freezing north. As the trio continued trudging through the snow, now almost reaching Kalen and Scylla's knees, Whisper came fluttering back. The bird chirped to its master, causing him to gasp softly. Scylla and Bakron exchanged confused glances. Could the human leading them actually understand his avian companion? Their musings were cut short when Kalen hurriedly pulled out his spyglass and peered into the distance. Cursing loudly, the human suddenly quickened his pace, breaking into as close to a run as he could manage while wading through knee-deep snow. The elf and dwarf rushed to keep up with their nominal leader. Their swift pace was brief, but Kalen continued to march with increased urgency for over 2 hours before abruptly halting. His companions could clearly see the reason for his sudden stop. For what seemed like miles were smashed wagons and torn tents. It appeared as if a great beast or an army had rampaged through and destroyed everything. Yet despite the devastation, there was not a single sign of life. No bodies, bloodstains, or even a slain pack animal left for the wolves. From the layer of snow that blanketed everything, whatever had occurred here had happened days ago, long enough for any tracks left by whatever had torn through to be erased. Kalen gazed upon the destruction with shocked and pained eyes, his staff hanging limply in his hand. "I'm too late."
You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.